morning, everyone. So welcome to Convo. My name is Faith Agbola, and I am a junior political science, international relations major with a minor in Africana Studies here at Carleton College. Alongside my academic pursuits here at Carleton, I'm very involved with several of the cultural orgs on campus and currently serve on the board of Women of Color Plus. Today, I am so excited to be here and to have the wonderful opportunity to introduce someone that I personally look up to and admire, our guest convo speaker, Mayor Melvin Carter. Our theme for this Black History Month is space, place, and belonging, a topic Mayor Carter has focused on throughout his life and career. Since taking office in 2018, his accomplishments include raising the city's minimum wage, tripling free programs in rec centers, eliminating late fines in public libraries, reestablishing an affordable housing trust fund, expanding immigrant and refugee support services, and launching an Office of Financial Empowerment. One signature initiative is CollegeBound Saint Paul, which is Mayor Carter's plan to start every child born in the city with a $50 college savings account. And hopefully, we'll see some of those kids at Carleton someday. As the first Black mayor of St. Paul, Mayor Carter lives and works by the motto, creating a city that works for us all means we must all do the work. His passion for helping others engage in civic processes is exemplified through his time training progressive activists and candidates in over 30 states, including here at Carleton in the 2005 campus Camp Wellstone. As a fourth-generation St. Paul resident, Mayor Carter leads with an unapologetic equity agenda to ensure that he is providing spaces and places for everyone to belong. On that final note, we are in for a very special treat today, and we are looking forward to hearing from someone who has shaped Minnesota history. Please help me welcome to Carleton College, St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter.
Good morning. Is it still morning? Yes. Good morning, Carleton. How are you all doing today? It is a real honor to be here. I know many of you know that I trace, as I think about the places where my roots go back to. Carleton is among them, as my mother, Walitha Tony Carter, who's here, is an alum of Carleton. And my father, Melvin Carter Jr., is here as well, who is a retired St. Paul police officer. I grew up in a house, and I share this with folks often. I grew up in a house, as a young person, you look at your parents, and that becomes your model for what an adult is. It becomes a model for who you'll be when you become an adult. And what I knew as a young person is that when I became an adult, I would have lots of keys on my keychain. I don't actually carry any keys whatsoever these days. I knew that I would like onions. I don't. And I knew that I would serve community because I grew up in a home with a police officer, with a teacher slash entrepreneur slash public servant. I grew up in a home with two parents who launched youth-serving nonprofit organizations. And I grew up, my sisters and I joke about, not knowing how the people who experienced unsheltered homelessness in our community would know that when it was storming and thunder and lightning and hail outside, that our house was the house that you could ring the doorbell on and ask to just wait out the storm. We grew up in a space, my sister and I always talk about how angry it makes us that we have to share our parents with all of the young people in community who grew up calling them their mom and dad too. And we would try to clarify that no, they're not your mom and dad in the same way as they're our mom and dad. I grew up in the city of St. Paul. And I grew up, as many young people do, not realizing how much I loved the city of St. Paul, but surrounded by adults. And you know that phrase, it takes a whole village to raise a child. I grew up in that village. I grew up at the center of that village, literally surrounded every day by adults who were determined to see me succeed, whether I wanted to or not. We grew up surrounded not just by our parents, but by teachers and mentors and elders and pastors and just community people who looked after us and took good care of us. So whether it was my schools or my community recreation center, I always tell folks our school bus drivers never knew where I lived. They just knew where the King Center was, because that's where we'd go every single day after school. And I ended up coming out of the St. Paul Public Schools and finding myself in a campus that's probably about as different from Carleton as you could think of. Florida A&M University, which is in a different state. It's in a different climate, and it's a historically black college, so it's something in a different dimension. I had 3 white friends in my university, and 2 of them were twins, to give you a sense of the cultural environment that we lived in. Ocean and River were their names, the twins. I ended up going to college, and I think about, as we sit on this college campus, I can't help but reflect on my time in college. And I went to that college, Florida A&M University, in Tallahassee, Florida. It's the capital city of Florida. And we ended up there during what ended up being something of an immersion experience. I, like you, grew up learning a lot about America in my classes. And one of the things that we learn is that America has had its problems, but fortunately those are all in the past. And as a student at this historically black college, one of the largest historically black colleges in the country, we experienced a whole lot of things that made us start to feel like America's journey may not be all in the past after all. We were there when the former governor of Florida tried to dismantle affirmative action in Florida. We were there for a series of hate bombings that played out on our campus, where some racially motivated person decided he didn't like the idea of a historically black college at all, and that he was going to plant bombs on our campus. We found ourselves in this space where the FBI was occupying our campus, and we had to wear our badges, our student ID badges, around our necks, or else you would be questioned by the FBI, what are you doing here and do you belong here? It was an incredible experience to have as a young person. And we ended up there during election 2000. I don't know if all of you are old enough to remember election 2000, but election 2000 and Florida and hanging chads, is this ringing a bell for anybody in the room? I was living at the time with my older sister, my brother-in-law, and their 2-year-old daughter. And I wasn't this super involved, like student government, student senate type of student. I was active on campus. I volunteered for like Habitat for Humanity and the NAACP. But in truth, electoral politics just didn't seem all that connected to just the quality of life of people in my neighborhood. That's a whole different session we can have some other time. And so when it came time for election 2000, it was kind of an important election. It was after Clinton left office, and so it was an open election for the president. It was George W. Bush versus Al Gore. Florida was a pretty important swing state back then, like it is now. And I remember thinking, I'll probably go vote after class if I have time. It's an incredible thought. I'll probably go vote after class if I have time. My older brother looked at me and he said, hey, listen, everybody living in this house is going to vote today. And there were no question marks. And so I got into the car and we went to the polling place. And of course, it's an open election, and it's a swing state, and it's Florida, so there's record turnout. And we ended up waiting in line. We ended up starting the line in the parking lot. And we waited in line for 30 to 45 minutes on a cold day outside. I love telling the story to Minnesotans that it was a cold day in Florida. But it makes the story better, you know? So we waited outside for 30 to 45 minutes. I voted and my sister voted, and my brother-in-law, who stood in line for 30 to 45 minutes with his 2-year-old daughter on one hand and his voter registration card in the other hand, got turned away from the polls. In those classes that I learned that America had some stuff in the past, I also learned that like the secret sauce of what makes America America, what makes this democracy great, what defines democracy, right? What sets us aside and sets us apart from every other civilization is that this is a country, this is a humanity, this is a grand experiment in which if you want to say, you get a say. And yes, there's like cynical voters, and yes, there's apathetic voters, and yes, there's non-voters. But if you want to say, you get a say. You've had that class, right? And so being 19, 20 years old and finding myself in this Florida polling station, having to argue the right to vote on behalf of my brother-in-law seemed incredibly foreign to me. As I think about the environment that I grew up in, I told you already, we lived this like middle class existence. Mom was a professional, a teacher, an entrepreneur, a political figure. Dad was a retired police officer. Our friends called us the Cosby family. And all of a sudden, this for me was one of the most profound experiences in powerlessness that I had ever felt. We stood at that table, arguing his right to vote against someone who really didn't have the opportunity to put him on the list. Minnesota is one of, I think, 6 states that has same-day voter registration, and Florida is now one of them. And so there was really no recourse for us in the first place. We were like angry, and we were embarrassed because, of course, there's people in line behind us who have also waited 30 to 45 minutes, and you know we were confused. And in the end, I realized mostly that last piece is what it was. It was confused because I couldn't figure out how to reconcile this notion that what makes America America is that if you want to say, you get a say, with this experience of being turned away from the polls. And so, for me, the work that I do tries to center around a grand experiment to say, one, none of you should ever get to feel that sense of powerlessness ever again. But two, to say, what if we didn't just stop there? What if we said, what's the opposite of this sense of powerlessness? What would it take to like actually invite you into the process of governance, invite you into the process of creating space, place, and belonging for yourself, as opposed to assuming that somebody's in City Hall doing it for you? As it turns out, we're not the first ones to think this through. When I was in college, like, you know, college is where you go to just think, right? And we spent a lot of time thinking. And it's funny, I ended up with a group of friends who we would go to the bookstore, and I mean, we should have gotten we should have gotten independent study credits for all the reading and studying and things that we did outside of class. My mother called that group a cult. I don't know if you remember that. But we started reading about different government systems and rebellions and, you know, different kind of movements in humanity over time, and started like going down this deep dive of saying like, well, why are people really so afraid of communism? And what's the difference between communism and socialism? And wait a minute, well, this notion of all like being in it together sounds good, but there's fatal flaws in all this because somebody, and how do you get to there? And like reading Mao and reading Fanon and reading what's the difference between Leninism and Stalinism? And what did Che Guevara really mean when he said this? And what did Malcolm X really mean? And what were the Black Panther Party for self-defense? What were they really trying to do? And how did Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, what would have happened if they had stayed alive and continued their journeys, which seemed to be sort of kind of coming into the middle? And I remember going through all of this revolutionary literature and trying to figure out like, what's it really about? And finally I read a document that just blew my mind. And I remember thinking, we should use this. It was called the Declaration of Independence of the United States. And if you haven't read the Declaration of Independence of the United States, at first I'm going to tell you it goes way off the rails after a little while, particularly as it talks about African people and indigenous people. But if you just go to that preamble, to that beginning part, and check out the ideals, it starts with one of my favorite words, we. We the people. And it says what I think is a really bold and revolutionary concept, that the governments are implemented, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's important. Governments derive their power, their just power. Our source of power is the consent of the governed. Pause. We've been through the Me Too movement, and we've decided as a country that consent has a very particular definition. It's not nobody protested or nobody said no. It's not nobody said they didn't want to go. It's nothing but an active and informed and participatory agreement. You know what I'm talking about? So if we say that the source of government's power comes from the consent of the governed, that's a revolutionary thing. And I'll just stop for a second and say, it does not say from the consent of the voters. It does not say from the consent of the adults. It does not say from the consent of the property owners. It does not say from the consent of the citizens, of only the citizens. It says it does not say from the consent of people who've never been to prison. It says the consent of the governed, everyone who falls underneath the power of the government. It says that governments, don't get mad at me, I'm talking about the Declaration of Independence. It says that the source of just power of our government comes from the consent, from the active, participatory agreement of all of the people who fall within the governance power for the purpose of facilitating life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all of us. And it goes further, and it says, look, and again, read it for yourself, because I get excited. It says, when a government fails to do that, that it's not only our right, but it's our responsibility to change it. And so all that to say is, what I've tried to do is launch a career and work in a way that says, how do we create how do we aggressively and creatively identify opportunities to establish the consent of the governed, to bring the governed into the governing processes, and see what happens from there. Because what I've learned is this. When I was running for mayor, one of the things that quickly became clear is the extent to which every day I talk to people and I say, why did you choose to plant your business in St. Paul? Why are you still in St. Paul? Why are you raising your kids in St. Paul? Why are you launching your career in St. Paul? Why St. Paul? Why are you choosing our space? Why are you choosing this space? And one of the things that becomes really clear really quickly is that the magnitude of dreams that people dare to dream in our city is a significant mismatch very often against the magnitude of plans and ambitions that we often launch from the halls of government. And this disconnect between our public movements and our individual movements is, I think, unacceptable. One of the things that it says in my bio is that we try to be an unapologetic advocate for equity. And the only way to do that is for us to decide together what equity means. It seems to me that I've learned, it doesn't seem to me, I've learned that oftentimes in our social justice worlds, we don't know what we mean when we say the word equity. We know what equity isn't. We know what it doesn't feel like. We know when the pictures aren't diverse, we don't like that. But we don't really know what it is. We don't have a shared common definition. I learned that my first year as mayor. My chief of staff walked into my office and said, "Hey, Mayor, do you want fireworks on the 4th of July?" I said, "Absolutely, I love the fireworks." He said, "They cost $100,000. And I said, "Absolutely not. What's next?" And just a couple of weeks after that, we actually were able to find $100,000 to launch a legal defense fund for immigrants and refugees who were at that time being targeted by the Trump administration. But a friend of mine who's been active in progressive politics with me for a very long time looked at me and said, "But isn't this an equity thing?" I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, black children and white children, and rich children and poor children, and children in every neighborhood can look up and see fireworks just the same. Isn't that an equity thing?" And I said, "Oh, no, not at all." Because equity has to be about intentionally dismantling disparities that exist in our community. But more so, we need an active definition. So what we're trying to do in St. Paul, and I think this connects very well to your theme, space, place, and belonging. When I think of equity, I like to abandon the social justice definition or lack thereof of it every chance I get. When I was at Florida A&M University, my major was business administration, and when my business school deans said the word equity, when in my brief corporate America career, when the word equity came up, it was never an amorphous concept. We always knew that we were talking about money. We always knew that we were talking about ownership, and we always knew that we were talking about decision-making power. So our challenge for our city, and my challenge for you, my challenge anywhere I go, when I talk to business leaders or nonprofit leaders or education leaders or government leaders, whatever it is if you want to be a champion for equity, I think it's not about like finding some amorphous concept that makes us all feel good and, you know, when we see the pictures, it makes us think we did it. But I think it's really about saying, how do we, when we identify a group of folks who we think we can serve, who we think my organization or my city or my church or my campus, who we think we can serve better, how do we be intentional about saying, that's not a group of people for me to go in my office and say, how do I serve those folks better? And, you know, how do I, come up in my mind? It's a group of folks for me to identify an opportunity for, to invite that community, to invite those individuals, to invite those families, to invite those students into decision-making processes. It's an opportunity for me to ensure that there's opportunity for those folks not just to belong to our community, but that to ensure that they know that there's something that belongs to them in our community. And so that's the work that we do. When I first got elected mayor, we launched, folks said, well, who's your cabinet going to be? Who's your transition team going to be? And, you think that, what that essentially is they're asking is like, who's the 10 to 12 to maybe 15, most insidery insiders as we move forward. And what we ended up deciding to do is create what we called community-based hiring panels, hiring committees. We needed 100 people to essentially take 3 days off work and come help us source resumes, help us sort through resumes, do the first round of interviews, and send me a slate of finalists to be our potential cabinet members. And people looked at us and they said, well, that's not leadership, what are you doing? And we argued that, leadership does, they said, you have to make a decision, you're not being a leader. And they said, you're never gonna get enough people. And Renee, let me tell you, 3 days later, we had 300 applicants. We had to turn people away. There's 200 people who are still mad at me because we just didn't have enough chairs in the room for them. So every member of our cabinet that we've, and I always tell folks, I really think that as proud as I am of the list of things that Faith mentioned, as proud as I am that we've raised the minimum wage, as proud as I am that we've put unprecedented dollars into affordable housing, working with our partners at the county, as proud as I am that we've launched 4 now guaranteed income pilots, as proud as I am that we've eliminated late fees in our libraries, that we've eliminated participation fees for youth sports, and that we've seen our community participation in both of those things just spike immediately as a result of those policies, as proud as I am of what we're doing, I'm even more proud of how we're doing it. Every member of my cabinet has been hired through a community-based hiring process. Every budget that we've brought to the city council has been brought through a community-based budgeting process. Every time we take on something important, when we raise the minimum wage, we did it by bringing labor leaders and chamber of commerce leaders to the same table. As we go through this process of reimagining public safety, we're doing it by bringing the police union president and our Black Lives Matter leaders to the same table to do it together. And we find that when people are willing to engage with one another, when people are willing to, before the pandemic, I always used to say, breathe the same oxygen. Dr. Fauci messed that all up for us. So I got to come up with a new thing. But when people are willing to listen to each other, to engage each other, to understand each other as members of the same humanity, to understand that you're a human being the same as I'm a human being, that we can walk into a space thinking we have nothing in common. We can walk into a space thinking that there's no common ground between the two of us, and we can find out that there is far more in common than we have separately. I shared you the story about being in college because there was a day actually after that election 2000 where we had this student march to the Capitol, and I was at the Capitol, and I got a call from my mom, and my parents said, hey, are you in class today? And I said, yeah. And they said, we think we see you in the background on C-SPAN. And it was this crazy moment because as a student that spent my time in class thinking and conjecturing and coming up with theories on the world and debating the differences between Leninism and Stalinism, all of a sudden we found ourselves at the center of the international news story. And I remember thinking, and it was my first time I ever thought about my own children. Because I remember thinking like, wow, my kids are going to learn about this in their history class sometime. And there's going to be a day when my children are going to put it together. And they're going to say, wait, this is Florida. And they say, wait, this is the capital city of Florida. And Florida A&M is in the capital city of Florida. And you were in college at that time. And they're going to say, Dad, you were there. And they're going to ask me one of the most dreaded questions that a child can ask a parent. We all, I assume I'm not the only one in the room, I want to know what my grandparents did after Pearl Harbor. I want to know where my parents were when Dr. King was assassinated and what you did during Freedom Summer. And it felt like one of these moments in life. It was the first time in my life where I really felt like my children are going to hold me accountable. Not for what I tweeted, not for what papers I wrote, not for what multivariate analyses I ran or what literary reviews I conducted, but my children are going to learn about this story and ask me, what did you do? And suddenly it felt like there's nothing in my life more important than having a compelling answer. You and I have something in common. If you're in college right now, you're in college during a traumatic period in human history. You have lived through a 100-year pandemic. You've lived through the murder of George Floyd. And if you've been in Minnesota, you've lived through the murder of Philando Castile, and the murder of Amir Locke, and the murder of Dante Wright, and on and on and on and on. You've lived through one of the most challenging economies in a generation. You've lived through a master class in what many of our prophetic speakers have said throughout time. Martin Luther King said we all live in an inescapable web of mutuality in which what impacts one of us directly impacts all of us indirectly. Those are beautiful words, and they echo words that other folks have said throughout time. But in a way, we sort of don't need the words of the prophets to understand that. You lived through it. If the pandemic has taught us anything, we know without a shadow of a doubt that if our neighbor doesn't have a safe place to live when it's time to shelter in place, that if our neighbor can't take a week off of work when it's time, when it's time to take care of a sick child, that if our neighbor can't go straight to the doctor when they think they have symptoms, you're less safe. We're all less safe. We've lived through that, right? We know that. We've experienced that. And at the same time, and I served as mayor through this time, in summer 2019, we had, I think, about 29 people who were living in tents in our city. At the onset of the pandemic, in just a matter of a couple of weeks, that number spiked tenfold, more than tenfold, peaked out over 380 people in the summer of 2020. In 2020, during the pandemic, St. Paul is a city of 315,000 people. That includes my 2-year-old. That's not 315,000 working age adults. That's 315,000 people total, including students, including retired folks in total. In our city of 315,000 people in 2020, we experienced almost 100,000 claims for unemployment insurance. It's a staggering number. In that same year, we saw a time where families who are used to carving out a middle-class existence and weren't used to worrying about things like this suddenly found themselves hoarding toilet paper, hoarding baby formula. And in that same year, in Minnesota, when we saw record need and record challenge, record economic crisis for Minnesotan families, in that same year, we saw CEO pay go up by 70%, 7-0. In that same year, we saw those of us who own stocks experience record-breaking stock returns. And so what you lived through, what your children are going to ask you about is, wow, in this period of time that on the graphs was an amazing, successful, incredible time for our economy, at the same time, more people were homeless and hungry and starving and in despair than ever before. At the same time, there's this global movement around race and racial justice following the murder of George Floyd. And they're going to ask you to be accountable for what you did, how you met this moment. They're going to want to know that you went to class. They're going to want to know that you did your papers. They're going to want to know that you studied for your finals. And they're going to want to know how you met the moment. One of the things that I learned in my studies is that if you look through the transformational moments in American history and world history, you won't find one that exists without young people. That is to say that if you look at the world in the way it is right now and wish that it was different and think it should be different and demand it to be different and know that you need to pass your future children a different world than you inherited from your parents, it's really you that has to do it. If you wait until the end of the semester, if you wait until after finals, if you wait until after graduation or after grad school or after you buy a house or after you get established in your career or after whatever it is, then it's all just going to stay the same. That's the one thing I can guarantee you. And that's why, and so when we look at, I'll make my way to my close. I don't know where I am against my time. I'll also warn you, I grew up in the black church, so I might say that 3 or 4 times on my way to being done. I say all of this to say, here's what we're trying to do in St. Paul. I've learned that we have inherited what I think of as a broken model of city building. We've inherited a model that tells us our biggest jobs, our most important jobs, are keeping our community safe. I agree, but the model that we've inherited centers around locking up all the young black and brown kids we can find and getting them as far away from us as we can. Right now, we're experiencing a heartbreaking, just challenging and traumatic increase nationwide in violent crime. And there are some of us who look and say, we got to go back to the tough on crime days. And I would tell you, America has never been tougher on crime than we were in the 80s. And we've never seen more gun violence than we saw in the 90s. And we cannot return to those same mistakes of the past. We need a new approach. We're told our biggest job is getting people around town and making sure that we're building transportation and transportation infrastructure. And we've inherited a model that says you can just pave a road right over people's house and kick them out. My family is from the historic Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul. Rondo is the neighborhood in St. Paul, the historic, thriving African-American neighborhood that was uprooted to build a freeway. I remember as a child, we'd be driving on I-94 through the Twin Cities, right around the Dale Street Bridge, and my father would say, "You're in my bedroom now." Because that freeway that we all drive on, that we all go on, took the homes of almost 700 families who were given pennies for the dollar, who were not properly reimbursed for their homes. It gutted the family inheritances. It gutted those family inheritances. In today's dollars, I've seen studies that suggest up to over $150 million in wealth stolen from our African American community. So my challenge is this: how do we create place, space, and belonging in our city for a group of people who have seen themselves subjected to public sector and private sector and nonprofit sanctioned efforts to do quite the opposite? I really believe that the national protest movement that we saw after the murder of George Floyd wasn't just a protest about police violence. It was a protest against all the ways that people feel like they see these systems that we pay into, these public systems that we pay into, that we help facilitate, that we're promised are going to help our children, and they feel like they have their knee on our neck. Our education systems, our employment systems, our housing systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when people ask, why are we doing things a new way? Oftentimes I ask them, I try to turn around the question and say, well, listen, why would we continue to do things the same way we've done them? And because one of the things we have to grapple with is comfort. And so as we seek to drive for a new space, I'm trying to argue to you that, one, equity is critical. And if we're going to fight for equity, that means not just general amorphic feelings of fairness. That means economic justice. That means bringing people into decision-making processes. That means expanding who gets to feel ownership of whatever it is that you're a steward of. For me, that might be property in our city. And one of the things that we've done is said we're going to launch what we call an inheritance fund to provide descendants of those families who were displaced from Old Rondo with up to $110,000 in fully forgivable financing to buy a home or renovate an existing one. You may be stewards of a classroom, you may be stewards of a university, you may be stewards of a nonprofit or a student organization, and your job then becomes, how do we expand the group of students who feel ownership of this organization? How do we expand the group of students who feel ownership of this chapel? How do we expand the group of students who feel ownership of this university in such a way that it's not bringing them into our university, it's bringing our university into them? And that's one of the challenges for St. Paul. Here's a quick quiz. Ready for it? It's school, right? What American city has more river frontage on the Mississippi than any other? I will give you a hint. I'm the mayor of it. Anybody? Did you know that? Anybody know that? Raise your hand if you knew that. The reason you don't know that, thank you. The reason you don't know that is because we're not really a river city. We don't have a lot of places to go have a beer, have dinner, enjoy or see a concert on the riverfront. As it turns out, water is one of the most historic, maybe the greatest social, cultural, economic asset that a community can have. The reason we haven't lived into our shoes, our footprints as a river city, is because we see our river wrong. We spent the last generation building bridges to get over our river instead of maximizing it as an asset. We see our diversity the same way in St. Paul. We have a city of a multicultural, international, multilingual city. And we believe that every moment we spend talking about how hard it is to eliminate disparities, every moment we spend thinking about how hard it is to teach English as a second language in a city where our students speak over 100 different languages at home, is a moment where we're missing out on the opportunity to leverage those cultural and human strengths as the power, as the promise that will take St. Paul into the future. You are students. You are looking at this from a brand new perspective. You are coming into our communities from a brand new perspective. You're investing in yourselves, and that's absolutely critical. We need you to invest in us. We need you to invest in our communities. We need you to invest in the communities that you want to live in the communities that you want to raise your children in the communities that you want to one day pass on to your children. And one thing we know for sure, we've tried to do it without you. We cannot build the world that you deserve without you. So I just want to thank you. I know we have a time for a Q&A, but I want to thank you for sharing the space with me. I want to thank you for inviting me into this space. I want to thank you for just taking the time to have this conversation with me. And more importantly, I just want to thank you for being the type of people in our community who believe in justice. If you came to see me talk, I assume that you're the type of person who believes in justice and the type of person who is committing yourself to expanding your own personal human capacity to help bring us the world that we all know that we deserve. Thank you very much. I'm going to stay here.
Thank you very much, Mayor Carter, for being here today with us. We enjoyed it immensely. And thank you for bringing your family as well. Nice to see you again. So we do have Q&A, and I see the hands are going up, which is great, but I just have a little bit of housekeeping. So luncheon, of course, I have to mention that. The post-convocation luncheon is full. So if you RSVP'd, we will see you at the Alumni Guest House. If you didn't RSVP, we'll see you perhaps at the luncheon next week. Which brings us to the point that next week is our last convocation for the term. So hope to see you there. But let us continue with this convocation with questions and answers, and you're the first I saw.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. As a St. Paulite, I very much appreciate seeing you here, and I really appreciate the work you've done for our city. I was wondering, a risky question to ask a politician, but as an idealist, I hope you answer. Is there anything that's a white whale for you, a policy that you really truly believe our city needs, that you just don't think will be able to happen during your tenure? And if so, what are you doing to try to make that happen in the future, and what can we do to make that happen at some point?
That's a great question. That's a challenging question. We are trying to literally throw everything at the fan. We're really trying to do all the things that we can and just launch ourselves into kind of building the city of the future. I'll tell you, I have essentially a scoreboard in my office that, one of the things that I laugh about some is how a lot of times we talk about like transformative change, and what we really mean is like our sound guy has has sliders that turn the microphones up and down, and oftentimes what we like package and try to sell as change is essentially just like taking all the stuff that we've always done and sliding some of them up again a little bit and some of them down a little bit and going, look how much we changed things. So we're proud of our ability to like actually fundamentally change the way our city kind of government operates. I would argue to you, if we had more time, that eliminating late fines in the libraries actually changes what a library is in a community in the first place. And so like those are the types of things that we're excited about. So I don't think there's any white whales, because like we essentially try to take on everything that we can think of. One of the things that I don't know that will get done while while I'm there, one of the things that we're in the process of launching right now is a vision to I talked a lot about like building a participatory, inclusive economy. And one of the things that we're really excited about is this notion of what can it look like for a city to facilitate literal community ownership. I want to build St. Paul as the co-op capital of the world. We want to think about what it would look like for our city government to facilitate low-income employees pooling their money to buy the business they work in, low-income tenants pooling their money to buy the building they work in, and we want more co-ops in St. Paul per capita than any place in the world, and that feels like something that we may get a chance to sort of set the deck for, but we may not be there long enough to see it come to fruition.
Hi, first of all, thank you for coming to talk with us today. And I gotta represent St. Paul Central wherever I can.
Boom, here we go. You're wearing the red and black too.
Yes, I
am.
am. So for my question, do you have any plans for promoting public transit infrastructure and service throughout St. Paul to, improve equitable forms of transit, especially on the east side of St. Paul? Any plans for that?
Yes, I'm an East Sider. I live on the east side of St. Paul. If you know, like where the Highwood Hills neighborhood is, that's where we live. The St. Paul Public Schools, we've complained for a long time that St. Paul doesn't have the same transit infrastructure that Minneapolis does. We've worked really hard, and part of what we're trying to do is create a city where you don't have to incur the cost of car ownership to live in our community. That's still the case. I remember when I got out of college and I was working, I was traveling a lot, and I got to the place, as a young professional, I'd love to rent a car when I got to a new city. And then I got to the place where I hated going to cities where I had to rent a car, because it was so much easier to just get on transit in the cities that invested in transit. And I think that's a centerpiece of what we have to be for the future. I'll tell you, folks ask me what my vision is for St. Paul, and in one word, I always tell them my vision for St. Paul is irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is when our children decide where they want to plant their family or their business, what they'll be looking for. And among other things, I think they'll absolutely be looking for transit. One of the things I'll tell you this, St. Paul is at our all-time high population right now. It's funny because people always look at me, you're ruining the city, and that's why people are moving out. I'm going to sell my house. And I always ask them, well, how many bathrooms does it have? Because if you put a house on the market in St. Paul, you'll find out just how many people want to live in St. Paul right now. And so we're at our all-time high population, and we have 2 decades of projected growth in front of us. So that means we have no choice but to sort of re-engineer our city for thousands more students in our schools, thousands more people call 911, thousands more housing units, thousands more people trying to get around. And so that means facilitating other ways than single occupancy vehicles. And I tell folks all the time, we've built almost 30 miles of bike lanes since I've been the mayor, and I tell folks all the time, we'll stop when you show me we're on University Avenue or we're on I-94, we can put 30,000 more single occupancy vehicles. No one's taken me up on that yet. I think there's lots of opportunities. I said I live on the east side to share. Our St. Paul Public Schools have shifted from school buses, like the yellow school buses that we're all used to allowing high schoolers to take the city bus to school. I live more than a mile away from the nearest city bus stop as an East Sider. And so that's one of the conversations that we're having right now. I think there's Metro Transit is doing some really, I think, innovative things. There's a pilot that they're doing on the north side of Minneapolis right now, which I think they call it like a micro transit pilot, which essentially they've got Metro Transit vehicles operating as Ubers, long story short, and thinking about how do we connect people kind of door-to-door type of service and think more entrepreneurially. So I think in many ways we have to think differently. It's going to require significant resources. As a city, we don't run our transportation system. We work closely with the Metro Transit, with the Met Council and Metro Transit, but we don't operate it. It's going to require significant investment, and we're going to be arguing at the state that that investment is worth it.
Hi. I feel like something that's true in our country is that local politics are extremely important, and for how important they are, we don't pay enough attention to them. But I think there are some issues that are largely approached at the state level and the federal level. Like St. Paul can't solve climate change. St. Paul can't change the way that Medicare works in this country and the way that transportation funding works in this country. And so how often when you're pursuing your goals do you run into obstacles like those, and how do you approach that?
It's a great question all the time. What we do, and I'll try to argue with you, municipal government is where it's at, period. So when I came out of college, I remember feeling I'm kind of a talented, smart guy, right? And I want to change the world. right? And I remember feeling like, and it's funny because when I was talking to a group of students yesterday, and one of the students said, I never thought I'd talk to a mayor. I said, that's funny, I never thought I'd be a mayor. And I really didn't, because I honestly remember feeling like, minds like mine should be focused on like, the ozone layer and, issues like, genocide and, ending war and, things like that, not like barking dogs and trash collection and stuff like that. But one of the things that you find out really quickly is, and somebody explained it to me when I was running for city council, I was knocking on doors and an older gentleman said, listen, when Betty McCollum, our Congress member, asked me for my vote, she's asking me to trust her on like foreign federal trade policy. And he said, but you're asking me to trust you on where my kids go after school. And it's so incredible the ways in which local issues hit us. Local issues hit home. And the reason I love local municipal governance is because that goal of mine of bringing people into the process is so much more accessible at the local level because of the visceral and immediate ways in which the work that we do touches people's lives. When the federal government shuts down, every now and then somebody asks me if the city's shut down too, and I tell them, oh, you would know by noon, you'd know by lunchtime if the city was shut down, because it impacts our lives on a day-to-day basis. What you've seen as our state and federal governments have become more and more gridlocked, frankly, we just got a federal infrastructure bill last year that we've been waiting on for literally a decade, and that to me is one of the most big signals of how dysfunctional our federal government ends up being. It took us literally 10 years to agree on fixing broken bridges at the federal level. And so what ends up happening is cities become laboratories for democracy. And I would argue that all of the innovative public sector type of things that you see happening, the bold, transformative, innovative, like never thought that could possibly be done, is happening at the city level, is happening in counties across the country. And even on like climate crisis, because St. Paul, we work hard to be a leader on climate. And you're absolutely right. We're sort of a drop in the bucket. But when Trump, for example, pulled America out of the Paris Climate Accord, I was one of over 400 American mayors who said, you know what? Our country, we're still going to meet our obligations under that. And as it turns out, if 400 mayors say we're going to do something, we're going to do it. And so we've built and we've established alongside those other 400 cities our climate goals as a city. We've set, and those 30 miles of bike lanes are part of it. And so we see local governments having to take it by necessity, frankly, because what ends up happening is, if something proves too hard for the federal government to get anything done about, if something proves too hard for the state government to get anything done about, the next place it elevates up to is the city, because we still have to address it at the local in community. And so you've seen mayors band together, and that's one of the things that I'm really proud of, is the way that mayors are banding together on issues like that traditionally haven't been municipal issues, that we're making it's not that we're making them our business. They have to be our business because we're the ones who live it on a day-to-day basis.
Hi, thanks for being here. I'm also a St. Paul Central grad.
Oh my gosh, this is amazing. Fantastic.
So I love St. Paul and I love SPPS, but something that's kind of been like circulating around the group chats right now is what happened at Harding High School. So I was wondering if you had any like thoughts or like future directions. I know that like the superintendent mentioned like increasing policing in St. Paul public schools, which is kind of like feels confusing because like 2 years ago we kind of decided that we shouldn't put so much policing in St. Paul public schools, at least central. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
It's a great question. And if anybody has an easy question next, feel free to wave down the... we last week had a student stabbed, a child, a teenager stabbed to death inside one of our schools, inside Harding High School. And it's one of the hardest things that I've had to go through as mayor. And it puts really all the questions on the table, honestly. For me, one of the directions that I've given my team and some of the advice that I've given to some of the other political leaders in the city is if ever in our lives there's been something that we should all maybe err on the side of overreacting to, it's a student being killed inside of one of our high schools. And so I'll tell you frankly, to me, I don't think we should be bound by the decisions we made 2 years ago when we faced something that traumatic. But we also, if we think the answer is to go back to where we were 2 years ago, that's probably not the answer as well. You know, public safety is the first thing that I think we have to do fundamentally different. And long story short, I think the problem with public safety is it's another thing that we get all wrong. You know, and we end up in this space. And I think the problem is that we oftentimes conflate public safety with emergency response. Emergency response is absolutely critical, and our emergency responders provide a sacred and vital service to us. And responding as quickly as possible after something terrible happens isn't public safety. Public safety is making the type of proactive investments and interventions necessary to reduce the number of times we end up having to call for emergency response in the first place. For all of us who have family members or younger brothers and sisters or cousins, or for my children, if you were to tell me that our plan to keep my 2-year-old safe in childcare where she is right now is to call for help as quickly as possible after something bad happens to her, that would be woefully insufficient. But that's the approach that we've taken to public safety in our country, with this promise that we've all experienced our whole life, that if we just build bigger prisons, hire tougher prosecutors, and hire more police, that our neighborhoods will be safe. Of course that doesn't work out that way, because all of those three things come into play after something terrible has happened. And so, yes, we want a stronger partnership between our officers and our schools, so that we can be connected and be able to share information. I think one of the bigger things, though, than just having a police officer in the school, and it's actually not clear that we're going to put a police officer in the school, but having the partnership is important. We've in St. Paul said, and I think there's two critical understandings that we have to really understand public safety. One is that there are events that happen in our city, in our country, in our world every day that absolutely there's just no substitute for a police officer with the tools and resources they have available to them. But two, just as importantly, is there are actually most of the things people call 911 for are not one of those things. Most of the things people call 911 for is because somebody's in crisis, because somebody needs help, because I have a concern, and because somebody's in a mental health or chemical health crisis, because someone is homeless, because et cetera. And we have to learn, and we're, I think, pioneering this in St. Paul, is when somebody calls the police because there's a homeless person sleeping on the bench, it's unclear what a badge and a gun can do to help solve that problem. So in St. Paul, we created what we call our HEART team, Homeless Assistance Response Team, to say, we're gonna go connect that person with emergency housing and shelter and support services that they need. In St. Paul, if somebody experiences a mental or chemical health crisis, it's unclear what a badge and a gun can do, if they're not threatening someone, et cetera, what a badge and a gun can do to help solve that process. And so we created our CARES team. I cannot remember the acronym offhand to save my life, but we created our CARES team to help connect, and it's a team of EMTs that can help us respond to people in crisis and help provide a more acute level of service to help solve the presenting problem. Our approach and my belief is that we ought to take that same level of care, that same level of thoughtfulness, and use it to reconstruct our safety systems in our schools and, frankly, in our recreation centers as well, and also blend them across, because one of the things that we see is we see conflicts play out in our rec centers, and then the same young folks go to school, and the school teachers and counselors don't know what's happening, and they're not equipped they're not ready to respond to it or prevent it, because they don't, the community, and that goes both ways. So I think what we need is the bigger public safety team, not just police officers. I do think it has to be connected to law enforcement, and I think what's going to do even more than the bodies and the badges inside the building is our ability to communicate across those across those channels and across those jurisdictions, so that we can do our best for our children.
Hi, thanks for coming. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned one of the probably more important inequities we have in the country, and that's voting rights and ability to vote. You mentioned your brother-in-law being refused the right to vote. One question there, what was the reason that they gave? Did they give one?
They just said you're not on the list. And they were right. If you read, if you're interested in that history, there's lots that have been written on how Florida went about scrubbing, pretty intentionally scrubbing
Yes.
their voter registration lists there.
Okay, and follow up on that. There's probably not too many states that are interested in changing our inequity in voting right now. What I'm getting at is there is no uniform voter registration requirements or right to vote across the country. It's a statewide issue, and 50 states have 50 different rules on voting. Not too many governors are probably interested in changing that, but I would imagine that seeing that there are more mayors in the country than there are governors, many more mayors, that it's more of an urban problem as far as inequity in voting, and there are more people that are affected by the inequity, that maybe this is something that the mayors could get together to work on to bring about a national uniform voting system, voting law. Would that be possible?
It's a good question. It's not something that I've necessarily been in kind of conversations around like a mayor-led movement on this. It's a really good question. Like I said, I think a lot of the solutions that we're seeing, the innovative and creative and urgent solutions, are coming from mayors. I'll tell you, in all the conversations that we have around saving democracy, I don't think democracy, I think voting rights are important. I don't think they save democracy. And one of the things that I've shared with some of my colleagues and cabinet members is I think democracy, thinking we can save democracy through voting rights is thinking like you can save a marriage by renewing your vows, right? It's a symptom of something. Our approach, my approach to say like how do we renew democracy is by making sure that people sense their place, space, and belonging in it, frankly. Is by ensuring that people see that we're using democracy to benefit them in some way. Quick story I'll tell you, I shared just briefly that we've piloted guaranteed income. We have a pilot in place right now where I think just over 300 families, low-income families with very young children, are receiving $500 a month, no questions asked, benefit for a period of 2 years. It's incredible because when we do things like this, we get obviously trolls who don't like that we're doing something in a different way. One of the biggest trolls that we hear is, why would anybody work anymore if you're just giving away money? I never heard anybody say that who could quit their day job for $500 a month. But one of the other, and also I'll tell you that one of the things that we found out is, because we do evaluation and research around this, one of the things that we found out is that people who receive this benefit actually gain employment, increase employment at a significantly higher rate than they would have otherwise, for obvious reasons. They can afford to put a child in childcare, fix up their truck, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the other things we hear is that like racist and classist trope that of what those people will do if we give them money. We always hear that, right? Oh, they'll just this and that. And so we're tracking the spending. We're giving it on a debit card. I say we literally have the receipts, and we can demonstrate that when those people have money, they spend it on groceries, they pay the rent, they fix up a car, they buy some clothes for their kids, and it's incredible that we're learning that those people spend their money a lot like us people would. Because there may not be a real them and us in the first place. And so all that to say is HBO is doing a documentary on our work, and one of the families they interviewed, there's this really incredible interview in the documentary that one of the families ends up talking about not just the policy but government, whether government can work, and he ends up saying like, I guess if government can do something like this and help our family, help our child in this way, then maybe government's a good thing. And that's a really profound kind of statement for me, and it bears out exactly what I'm suggesting is, I think what mayors are trying to lead on is demonstrating how government can be a relevant and effective force to make people's lives a little bit better and a little bit easier. And our hope is that as we fight for voting rights reforms, and we have a big deal going on in Minnesota. We're really proud that we always lead the nation in voter turnout. I believe that this legislative session this year, we're going to see felon voting, people who have who have a felony on their record return their voting rights upon release from incarceration. That's really critical. That's really important. I'm excited for us to get that done as a state. And we also have to energize those types of policies with reasons for people to get engaged, and that's what I've tried to center my work around.
And on that note, I'm afraid we've come to the conclusion. Thank you very, very much, Mayor Carter, for being here, and thank you all for attending Convo.